Before I get too carried away building the app, I thought I wanted to show you a bit about my development environment. Now, everyone has different preferences when it comes to these sort of things, but I've picked up a few things over the years from watching other people and talking to colleagues and friends and things. So hopefully there's something that's going to be interesting to you in here. So let's begin. I'm going to have a little look at VS Code, or Visual Studio Code, which is what I use for actually writing some code. So let's open that up. So the theme here, we've got the Night Owl theme, I think this is. Let's see. Yeah, this is the Night Owl theme, so nice and blue. You can get that from the extensions store if you like it. Let's have a little look at the extensions we've actually got in here. So under installed, you can see I've got 11 extensions. I'm not a huge extension person. Most of these seem to be GitHub. So GitHub Actions, GitHub Copilot, GitHub Copilot Chat. Ruby LSP, I'll show you that in a minute. That's really good. That was built by Shopify and really helps with formatting your code, making it look nice, making sure it's consistent, following Ruby rules and highlighting things that are obviously in violation of those rules. I'll show you some of that in a second. Goes on here as well, Night Owl, non-breaking space highlighter, but really not a lot. And that's one thing that I find is I don't use a lot of extensions. I like to try and just have as minimal interruptions as possible while I'm coding in here. Talking of interruptions, let's have a little look at a file. Let's open up, let's say our application controller, and we're going to look here at the Copilot stuff. So for a start, when you're typing with Copilot, it just tries to insert stuff. Now, one thing I've done is I've turned that off. I would much rather Copilot be triggered by me. So if I'm here on this line, it's going to just, if I was there normally, it would just say return the current user, which doesn't really make any sense. It's just completely guessing what should happen there. So if I do def account required as an example, let's see what it writes for that. Yeah, I like that, I'll put it in. But I had to trigger that. I didn't want it to just be thrown in, because if that happens, it's very tempting just to put stuff in, then, oh, that looked good, and then forget that Copilot wrote it when it comes to it later and find that it's buggy or just completely wrong. So yeah, I don't like it happening, so I've turned that off. We just do that manually. Now, I mentioned a minute ago about Ruby LSP, which is the language server for Ruby. So in here, that means, let's do that account required method again, I've got these little lines, so these show up. So if I do hello equals world, now it's highlighting that hello is unused and that world doesn't have double quotes. And when I save, that automatically and very quickly gets updated, and that's really useful. I really like that part of that, because in the past I've used things like Solargraph, Rubocop Daemon, things like that are fine, but also they tend to be slow or they have a pain, whereas Ruby LSP has just sort of arrived and just works. So would recommend that a lot if you're working with Ruby stuff. Go and have a look at Ruby LSP. And that's pretty much all I've got going on in my editor, to be honest with you. I have the font size quite big, so I don't have to sit too close. I quite like that, but other than that, fairly sort of standard basic VS Code setup. So looking at the next thing that I use quite a lot, iTerm. iTerm is the terminal I use for running stuff. And what I tend to do is I tend to have VS Code open and iTerm open next to it, and then just I can command tab between the two when I want to do things. So if I want to run the tests for this, well, first we need to be in the directory. So if I was in the directory and I run, not CDF, that doesn't mean anything. If I run RSpec, then that will run there, rather than using the embedded thing. I've just got used to very quickly tabbing backwards and forwards. Now, while we've got the terminal open, let's have a little look at how I deal with dependencies like Ruby, Node, things like that are different between projects. Let's close that down and have a little look over here. So I use a tool called Mise, or Mise, depending on how you want to pronounce it. It's called M-I-S-E. And if I run Mise ls, I will see a list of all the different dependencies I have installed and the different versions. The green one also shows which one's activated. So as I move around my machine, if I change directory to other places, it'll look to see what version should be active and activate that. So when I run Ruby here, I get Ruby 3.3.2 because that's defined in the gem file. If I want Node, I get Ruby Node here on this line, Node 20.11.1, because that's defined in the Node version file. So as I move around, those things are there, and whenever I go to a new project, I can just type me's install, and that goes through and installs the right versions of everything for that project. So would really recommend that. It's sort of a fork from ASDF, if you might have used these before, and it replaces things like RBN, RVM, RBenv, RVM, NVM, all those things, and they all come in one. And as you can see here, it also does things for like kubectl, kubecontext, Argo CD, Go, useful for loads of things in there. Really like using that, works really nicely. Now talking about running things, it wouldn't be 2024 without some Docker containers. So we've got some containers here that I run all the time. So looking through this list, we've got Postgres, InfluxDB, Redis, MariaDB. I use containers to run database services on my computer. So if I need a MariaDB server, I can just spin up the container for that. I have just sort of one of each of these running, and then I use them. I expose the ports locally and then use them in the applications as necessary, and that works really well actually. I quite like that approach. Saves having lots of brew services, and upgrades are really easy. So would recommend that for running databases. As far as actually running Docker on macOS, you've got a couple of choices, Docker Desktop being one and OrbStack being another, that are easy to work with. Now OrbStack is a commercial product for if you're using it for commercial use. We provide licenses for OrbStack to all our Mac users at Crystal, so we've got access to this. The alternative, as I said, is Docker Desktop, but if your business has a turnover over, I think it's 10 million euros, you have to pay for that as well. So it's not really a choice between paying and not paying. You can run things like Docker Engine, I think, on macOS, but no one's got time for that. So we just provide this for everyone to use as they need to, and that works quite well. So we talked about databases, we talked about containers, we've got everything running, but how about the actual application? How about cat apps? So the way I do that is using a procfile and an application called Foreman. So we have procfile.dev here that defines the different processes that we want to run in our application. We've got a web process, which just runs our web server. We've got a worker process that runs Sidekick, and then a JS and CSS process that run ESBuild and Tailwind CSS through Node, which compiles the JavaScript and the CSS required for the application, and they run along with it. So when we run bin dev, which is a sort of a binary we have within the application, or a executable within the application, that runs Foreman and then runs the application. And that's all that's needed to run the app. The worker's now running, the web server's running, and we can access that quite easily on that port, or in my case, we can access it through this domain, through catapps.ac.crystal.dev. Now, the way that works is a little bit complicated, but really worth trying to get this right for you. So I'm going to sort of tell you a little bit about that, and I'm going to put a link on the screen as well for a blog post about how I've set this up. So the basic idea is we've got this ac.crystal.dev domain, and all the subdomains on that are going to be applications that I run. So cat apps is one of them, but it might be something like Crystal Identity, or it might be Catapult itself, or Postal, or things like that, and they can all be accessed on those domains. The way to make this work is a little bit complicated on the DNS side, because you've got to make sure that star.ac.crystal.dev resolves to your local host address, which is 127.0.0.1. Now, the way I do that is I use DNS mask, which is a DNS server you can install on Mac, and that takes a domain and says only return 127.0.0.1 for all the domains. So anything.ac.crystal.dev on this machine. So if I ping hello.ac.crystal.dev here, I'll get a response from 127.0.0.1, which is my local machine. And that applies to everything on that domain. But that's also a public domain. Crystal.dev is a public domain that's available to anyone. Anyone else could access that, and the external DNS servers in the world will choose how to route that. And we'll talk a bit about that later for when you want to expose your applications to the whole world. But when you go to that catapps.ac.crystal.dev, what happens next? Well, we looked at it, we saw it a little bit earlier when we looked at that OrbStack thing, but what happens there is it opens, it makes a connection to Caddy, which is a really simple web server. Let me show you the config file for Caddy. That's in the local Caddy directory. So in here, we have a Caddy file, and the Caddy file defines what happens when these requests come in. So here are cat apps, it's catapps.ac.dev, and that gets handled by the reverse proxy back to my main machine, because this is running in a container. So it goes into the container and then back out the container to my machine to port 4040. Now I assign like sort of 10-ish ports in a range to every application that I'm working on, so I can easily route that to the right place there. What you might have noticed as well is that this is SSL, and this has a valid Let's Encrypt certificate on it, which is really useful as well, because the whole world's HTTPS. It makes sense to develop in HTTPS 2. Why not? I mean, there's no shortage of CPU power to do a tiny bit of extra encryption. And the way I set that up is through Cloudflare, but there are other options you can use with other providers. So Let's Encrypt normally, if you've ever used it before, you'll know that when you make a request or when you set up a web server for, let's say, catapps.ac.crystal.dev, Let's Encrypt can get a certificate for that by hosting a file with a code in it, and then its verification servers make a request to that file to verify that you actually own and control that domain. The problem we have here is that our domain, ac.crystal.dev, is hosted on my local machine, which is not available to the world. So those Let's Encrypt servers are not able to actually access that, that path to actually verify the account. So we have to do it using DNS instead. And that process works by Caddy creating a DNS record on our domain in Cloudflare with a code. The Let's Encrypt verification service then verify that record's been uploaded, and if it has, then they can assume that we control the domain and therefore issue the certificate. So the way we do that is we use the Caddy Cloudflare DNS integration. We tell this TLS DNS Cloudflare and our API token, which is available in the container, and that goes and accesses the Cloudflare account, it uploads that record, and then we get certificates issued automatically. And that's all that's needed for that, and that gives us SSL on our local development domain. Again, I'll put a link below on the screen now with a blog post a bit about how all that works and how to set that up in a bit more detail. I won't go into huge detail in this video on that. But that means I'm always working on what look like public domains on my local machine. Now, they look like public domains. They can be accessible from the outside world, but obviously not directly. You'd need to go into your DNS, presumably on Cloudflare, if you're using the Cloudflare routing here, and create an A record to point that to a server that is available on the internet, maybe a virtual machine or something like that. So if you've got that virtual machine running, you can then proxy the traffic from that virtual machine to your development workstation. Now there's a few ways of doing that. Cloudflare tunnels is one option. I don't know a lot about that, but I'm told it works. Or something like Tailscale, which you can install for free if you've just got a couple of personal machines. And what Tailscale does is it establishes a private network between a number of specific hosts. So maybe your virtual machine, which might be running a data center somewhere, and your laptop, which means you get an IP address that you can access on both of those machines for the other. So on your VM, you can access your laptop whenever it's connected to the Tailscale network, or the Tailnet as they call it. And when that's enabled, you can have traffic routed over that connection as well, which means you can just install Caddy on a VM and have it route ac.crystal.dev to your laptop whenever it's on. Now what you'll find here is, in my case, I don't route all the paths to that, so you can't just go to catapps.ac.crystal.dev now and access it. But I do have it set up so I can receive webhooks from external services. So if I was going to have Stripe in this account, as an example, I could easily set up a webhook URL in Stripe that can still access my laptop whenever it's on, which is really quite handy. I like that a lot. I find it very useful. And that's it, really. That's how I do all of that. It works really nicely. I recommend people having a look. Again, blog post on the screen now. Have a look at that. If you've got any questions about any of the development environment that I've talked about, let me know. In the next video, I hope we're going to have a little look at the actual Rails dependencies that we're using in the application, the gem file. We'll have a look at see what things we're using for databases. Obviously, we're using Postgres. What sort of gems we're using for configuration management, what gems we're using for logging. There's lots of things like that I want to go through with you. So we'll do that hopefully in the next video. So do subscribe if you can. If you can press like, that would be really useful. It lets me know that someone's actually watching this and that it's not a complete waste of my time. Do check out the last video as well, where I did a little demo of what I've been working on. and hopefully that's been interesting. Right, I will catch you on the next video, which will be out next Friday. We're going to do a video every Friday, I think. I'm still trying to get to grips with this, but I think Fridays seem like a good day to make a video. Maybe a bonus video on Mondays with a demo of what I did in the last week, but I will see you on the next video. Bye for now.